Okay friends, one of the first things we need to do to get started on our job is to safely raise and support the front of the truck so the wheels are off the ground. After that, remove all 5 of your lug nuts and then the wheel. Now the next thing that we need to do is break free our jam nut. I'm gonna go ahead and grab onto this with some long pliers. Just turn the tie rod. Okay. Once you have that broken free, we're going to move along to removing the outer tie rod end from the knuckle. We need to start off by removing the cotter pin. Slide this out of here and discard it. Now we're going to remove the nut. Take that nut, start it on there just a few threads. Next we're going to take a hammer and we're going to hit right along the knuckle right here. There we are. Remove the nut. Remove your outer tie rod end from the knuckle. Now that we have that removed, the next thing we're going to do is start unscrewing the outer tie rod end from the inner tie rod. Something about that though is you want to make sure you count the amount of times that this spins around to get removed. 1, 2, and so on. Okay, take that number, write it down somewhere. Next, remove your jam nut from the inner tie rod end. Okay, at this point, the next thing that we're going to have to do is remove the inner tie rod end boot from the power steering rack. To do that, typically there's going to be a clamp that's along each end of the boot. So if there's a clamp here, go ahead and remove that clamp, and then on the inner portion as well. Once you have both of your clamps removed, continue on by removing the boot from the power steering rack and the inner tie rod end. Inspect your boot, make sure it's still in good condition. If it's torn or damaged in any way, you need to replace it. This looks great, so I'll set it aside. Now the next thing you're going to want to do is carefully turn your wheel to the left. That's going to expose that inner tie rod end for removal. Now typically there's going to be an inner tie rod end tool that you can use to get over this and you're going to be able to remove it. If you don't happen to have that tool, you can just use some long pliers. Once it's broken free, go ahead and remove it from the power steering rack. There it is, friends. With that inner tie rod out of there, the next thing that you want to pay attention to is the threaded area inside of the power steering rack. Make sure it looks like it's in good condition. If it's damaged, that's something that you're going to need to deal with. Other than that, follow it down this way. If you see any fluid coming running out of this and dripping down onto the ground, that means that your power steering rack is damaged and you need to replace it. Okay friends, now it's going to be time to install our brand new inner tie rod end. Start by removing your jam nut. After that, we're going to continue on to screwing this into the power steering rack. I like to use a little bit of blue thread locker. Definitely don't use any red. We'll start it in, snug it up. Now I'm just going to go ahead and give this a couple tugs once it's bottomed out. That's perfect. You don't necessarily need to keep prying on this because we don't want to cause any damage to the power steering rack. Now that you have it tightened, the next thing that we want to do is add some of the grease that was included with your inner tie rod end. When you add the grease, you're going to go ahead and pivot this down, put some inside this ball and socket right along here, work it around a little bit, and then go ahead and add some along the other side. Don't use all that grease package though, because we're going to be using a little bit more up along this line here. Take some of that grease, come right up along here. This is where the boot's going to ride. If you don't put any grease here, there's a possibility the boot will get stuck and the alignment professional will have an issue. Now let's go ahead and re-straighten out our wheel. Okay, now we're going to move along to putting on our Bellows boot here. This is going to be the boot that goes over your inner tie rod end and of course the power steering rack. If you don't have those clamps, or maybe they were broken or even missing, just continue on by using some wire ties. Leave them nice and loose while they're on the boot like this. After we slide it on, we'll tighten it up. Just going to slide this right down. Slide it over the power steering rack down at the end here. Now let's go ahead and tighten up my wire tie. Trim off the excess, and of course do the same to the other one. Now let's apply some copper never-seez along the threaded area here. Let's put the jam nut on there. Now it's going to be time to put our outer tie rod end on. As you put this on, you want to count the threads as it goes in. Remember the amount that when you remove the original one and match it. So I had 15 for mine. I'm just going to continue on until I get to 15. Once you have that threaded on, continue on by putting it into your knuckle. Start your nut on there. We'll snug it up and then we're going to torque it to manufacturer specifications. Let's torque this to 51 foot-pounds. Now the next thing you want to do is make sure that the slot on the nut lines up with the hole that goes through the tie rod stud. If it doesn't, you need to continue tightening the nut until the very next slot does. After that, grab your cotter pin and put it in. Once it's through, go ahead and peen it over. This ensures that the nut will not loosen up on its own. Okay, the next thing we need to do is go ahead and tighten up our jam nut. The torque for this is going to be 60 foot-pounds if you can get your torque wrench on there. For me personally, I'm just going to use these pliers, make sure it's snug. Okay, once you have this tight, the next thing you want to pay attention to is the tie rod end. You want to make sure that it's sitting parallel to the knuckle. If it looks like it's twisted like this one does, just go ahead and straighten it out. Okay friends, we got the truck all back together. What's left to do now? Go ahead and take it for a road test down to your local alignment shop.